Hi, everybody. Welcome to 2014. We're officially living in the future. And we're going to talk about mech design today. And I'm testing out a new mic. I am working on actually a Wacom tablet, a Cintiq that I've had from Wacom for about a year, but I had it over on my demo desk in my teaching area, and I moved it over here because I redid my whole workstation this holiday break. Well, that was relaxing, which is probably why I'm a little bit under the weather today, because everybody knows when you take time off, it's the best time for you to get sick. So I'm going to stick it out today and do my best to launch our new year of Free Tutorial Fridays. So I'm working with a new mic. Hopefully it's better. Hopefully you like it. I'll probably refine it over the coming weeks to make it better. And on a new system with a new desk, so things might be a little bit clumsy today. And I'm under the weather, but we all have to do things when we don't feel like doing it. So this would be one of those days. I had quite a few requests on my Facebook page sometime, I can't remember when, last year. We asked for some subjects, and I also asked everybody here for some subjects for the coming year. And this was one of the recurring requests, which was to talk about mech design. So let's get going. So to design something like this, the way I would approach that is pretty straightforward, much like an industrial designer would approach any project that they do. It usually starts with research. So, and much like the human body, you've got to know some anatomy first. So the way you would do that is ideally you go to some place like a industrial museum, like a good museum on science and technology. And there's actually, displays, interactive displays that talk about how cylinders work, hydraulic cylinders, that sort of thing, and gears, and those are great things. But short of that, of course, just jump online. I typed here in Google heavy equipment, and you can start to find articles about how things work. You can also start to look at where pivot points are, and basically when you're doing mechanical walking objects or walking vehicles, which is basically what we're doing today, a bunch of walkers, you need a whole bunch of pivot points, and then you need effectively muscles, in this case hydraulic cylinders, to articulate those moving limbs, right? You could easily imagine this as a leg of a mech. And so you have to have cylinders and pivot points and hydraulic hoses to deliver the hydraulic oil to get all that stuff to work. So that's a good place to start. And so you could see pretty clearly that by doing some of that sort of research, it informed if I wanted to have a pivot point. Let's just draw over the top of this a little bit. Well, I'm going to be a little slow and rusty today. I haven't worked in Photoshop for about a month. All right, so here's a vertical pivot on center, let's say, and then I wanted this back element right here to be able to rotate. So in top view, maybe there's the back. Here's the pivot point that connects the two, and then I have this other part out here at the front. There's the center line, and right here's a pivot. And so I wanted this back to be able to move left and right. Well, I needed a hinge, right? So basically a big vertical pivot point. And then I need articulators, and so those would have to be offset a little bit, and then those would be offset up here a little bit, and then there's my cylinder. Then I have a big notch cut out of here as well, so it would fit, clearance inside. So when it moves this element, so this guy's connected to that, and then there's the pivot, and this moves back and forth like this, and that in turn pushes it left and right, and pulls, pushes and pulls. So same sort of thing goes for the legs, right? If I've got a pivot point here, actually maybe this is locked down to that, and then here's a pivot, right? There's a pivot, and I want to move this, then I have to be offset from that, and it pushes back and forth. Same here, pushes back and forth, and that pivots it around that spot. And there's some adjustability. I don't know why this is adjustable here, but it is. And that's just, added elements to make it look more believable. So that's a good way to start. Of course, we're going to start with some sketches first, but you've got to do some research and learn about some anatomy. So here's another great thing to search. Robotic arms. Okay. Now you could just start first with sketches and not worrying really about the mechanicals too much, let's pop over to here. Let's open up some sketches. Okay. So in fact, there's the sketch right here. We're just looking at the rendering of that one. So you might just start by saying, well, I want to do something that's a quadruped. So the way I like to start these is to give myself some really loose parameters, well, it's a biped, it's a quadruped, it's going to carry a person. So the things I like to play with a lot are, right, how many legs? So in this case, right, we've got these 4 legs. You see I've got a lot of joints in here for articulation. So if you know the thing you want it to move a lot, then you have to have a lot of pivot points. And then I have some little hints of cylinders, you know, in there, even at this early stage. But you don't have to have those, like this doesn't. Those little sketches, it's just, you know, linkages, right, with pivots, right? Just things that are going to pivot. Then you know that it can move, and then later you work out the engineering. So you might first start with the gesture, like these are much more gestural. And I'm just thinking about these sort of big rounded, you know, simplified geometric forms. I thought basically this big, you know, sort of rounded off box connected to this little part. So all I'm really thinking about early is silhouette, right, proportion, and then stance. So it's the classic vehicle subjects to think about, right? And I think about the division of those, so I'm not going to make those equal, right? So this looks like about a 70-30 maybe, which is always a nice balance. And so I'm just looking for proportions, and I'm going to work out the mechanism after the fact. But I am starting to include and hint that there are pivot points, right? And some of the pivot points can be hidden behind some of these bigger blocky shapes. So I'm just assuming that somewhere behind there it connects to the body. Same through here. Might also start, see there's a pivot, and then there's the cylinder. It's cut out there to leave room for articulation. Other times I might think more about the pivots early. Let's look at a couple of these sketches. So you can see that here's a vertical pivot, and then a way to articulate it, right? Make it move left and right so it can walk. And then up on top is a cylinder around a pivot that moves this leg this way. And then there's another cylinder around a pivot, and that moves the foot this way. And then the entire leg moves around this pivot, right, like that. And so if you have those in place, then it will walk. And I don't have the hoses or any of that sort of stuff. And then the top here is also on a pivot, and so it can spin, right, around that center. And so once you learn some basic anatomy, then you can just start to play with the length of those legs, the cylinders, the pivots, the articulation points. And that's really a big part of designing walking vehicles, is playing with those alignments and then deciding on how you want to engineer it. You can do it after the fact, so you could start with something as abstract as this, right? I'm just hinting that there's mechanism behind there and some big pivots. So if you have enough panels that are overlapped and they're disconnected, then we could sort of believe that there's all the mechanical stuff in there that you need to make this leg move. The other thing I like to play with a lot early is scale. So I always like to drop a human figure in there. And if they're in a cockpit or something, I like to have them doing something. Always some, you know, hands at the controls or something like that, or looking down. There's 2 people on this one, right? This weird little outboard piece. I don't know what it does, but they're, you know, maybe talking to each other. And there's a couple guys here, you know, busy working on something, checking the fuel levels. So early on, that's how it starts. Just look for the big gesture, the big proportions, figure out the stance, then go do the research and figure out what type of mech or robot you want it to be. And that's where you start to go and do things like this. You'll say, well, I want it to be streamlined with some internal cables that are, you know, pulling around some pulley centers, right? So you'll find some inspiration here, and then you can start to go back and re-engineer from your original sketch something that has more realism based on doing your research. So, and you can find all sorts of variations. Well, I want all exposed mechanism. Well, there's a nice example, right? Say, well, no, I want it to be all enclosed. Well, here's a nice example. This looks very much like insect joints. And so that would also be a good thing to go research. Here's another one that's fully enclosed. So these are great spots to start. Here's some with these inflatable muscles. So it could be pneumatic as well. So great places to go for inspiration and research. And then inevitably you might find something like this, Boston Dynamics. It does some amazing robots. And if you want to be freaked out by a couple of these in a good way, go find their website. Just type in Boston Dynamics. You can go there. And then you can see this, and that's great inspiration. And then you can look at the mechanism. So it's a way to learn about the anatomy. And I encourage you to go read about the amazing work that they're doing. So super inspiring stuff. Now, when I'm looking for inspiration on the design side, I like to go out and do all my own photography and do my own research on the aesthetics. So let's kill these sketches for now. And let's jump over to Bridge and let's look at some sketches, or sorry, some photographs. Okay, so before we look at some of these renderings, we're just talking about things like insects. Actually, insects, it's very hard to go and do your own photography. So I might go onto Flickr or something, do some visual research and try to find some nice inspirational photography. And what I'm looking for here, and also there's great to pick up books on the subject, but insects are amazing because they're already quite robotic, right? Or quite mechanical, I should say, because they're exoskeletons. And so it looks just like that glove or that arm that we saw with the fingers. And you can imagine all you really need to do, right, is they already, throw some mechanism, throw a person on there for scale, and you're already quite a long ways away into inventing something interesting. I'll show you some other ones. Fossils are great. In fact, I think there is, let's see, let's go back over to here. This guy right here, I think the steps are, in one of my lectures, I think there's the steps of this being painted, as well as this one. And both of those came from this photography trip I did walking through in Toronto, their Natural History Museum there, and shooting all these skeletons because I was thinking, well, what are mechanical walkers? Well, they're basically just a bunch of, links, or segments, like these bones, these legs connected with pivot points. And so what naturally has that? Well, a bunch of fossils already have that. So they're a great spot to start. And they're posed, and they're a lot of times posed dynamically. And so it can be very inspirational and a great spot to start doing some research for doing mechanical walkers. And you can imagine you just replace the muscles with cylinders, and now you have a mechanical, right? That's what we used to call them, was mechanimals, right? A mechanical animal is mechanimal. Let's see, minerals. So this one, right? That was the photographic underlay that I painted directly over. And in this case, after I found the inspiration, which was this photograph I took of the mineral, then I went back and painted on it, and I got right over the top, and I got this guy. And the thing about this one, I was just talking about anatomy, this one assumes that it's in a realm of fantasy. There's a little bit of mechanism underneath here, but it's pretty unrealistic that it's, got real, pivots and joints. All I did was put in some separation seams and overlap some of the blocky shapes. So your brain thinks there's some mechanism behind there that might be able to make it work. But it might be much more in the realm of an animated film where this is all fantasy. And there's energy fields or something to hold this thing together. So it doesn't really need to be, exactly old school heavy equipment style. You can also say, well, my anatomy or the rules of my world, allow for fantasy and magic. And so I can have this loose assembly of these blocky, bulky shapes and forms, and they're held together by magic. Totally viable. You create the storyline, you create the narrative and the rules of your world. Just when you make those rules, be sure that everything else you design for that world is consistent with those physical rules that you set out and arrive at from the beginning. So if I said that for this, then maybe I could then apply that to other vehicles or even buildings, things like that, or furniture, for instance. So just be consistent. Again, you create the rules and you create the design parameter when you're designing something for yourself. When you design it for other people, of course, those are all dictated for you, and you have to be sensitive to that. Okay, so here you can see I've got, minerals, which would be, nice gestural standing. It's a mineral, actually. It's not, it's nothing, it wasn't designed. It just occurred naturally that way. But you can see that these are some pretty amazing underlays to get you started. Actually, if you imagine the holder for the mineral is actually the little legs. That's kind of a funny little weird walking critter with a strange rider on top. Maybe there's his head up at the top, and I don't know what this is. Maybe there's another growth coming off of this. But you can start to see there was the original start for that other crystalline one. You can see all sorts of things in nature, and so it's very important to get out and travel a bit, try to get to museums, do some research. There's another nice posed couple of characters. As you start to change your point of view, you start to see the world in a different way, and I'm already seeing it in the way that I'm talking about. What's in here? Other animals. I always thought this guy would be a great quadruped. Change this into a cockpit, the head, and then draw a guy off balance here, maybe standing up here driving this thing. You can see the dust, jumping, just like is leaping out of a big sand dune or something, much like that other rendering. But crabs, exoskeletons, they're all fantastic things to start with, and insects. So those are great fun and enjoyable research trips. Here's a bunch of pivots and cylinders. If you wanted to go more retro, old school with your materials. And this was a bit more the inspiration for the rendering that we have up right now in Photoshop. You look at this one, right? Look at all those. I like those big cylinders and rusted materials. And I don't think I saw that as the color palette, but maybe I did and it stuck with me, and that's kind of what I've got going here. So I have these sort of old retro shapes and big cylinders and maybe some steam coming out the side. So that was all inspired by going out and doing a bit of visual research. So I think it's very important to get out and do that stuff, and that's how you learn about anatomy. Most of the questions people have for me about how to render robots or mechanical objects is about these sorts of things. How do I know how to make it work? Well, you've got to get out and do a little research and go to museums, read books, and go out and shoot some photography. If I want to do an armored element, I might go out and shoot some. This is all from the Met in New York City, and so I'd have a lot of reference for things to look at for armor plating, overlapping elements. So you say, well, I want to have it all armor plated because it's a battle bot of some sort. And you say, well, okay, if it's going to go into battle, then we need to hide all those soft bits, much like this knight is doing, and we need to hide the hoses and everything. So if you don't just clip a hose and then it can't walk anymore, so we might need to put some articulated armor over the top, and that's what you can find in a piece of reference like this, or those articulated elements. And so you have to have some overlapping bits that have hinges, allow them to slide on each other, and that's all great reference and source material to make what you're designing from your imagination, hopefully something we've never seen before, to make it more believable. Also, maybe a team of craftsmen made this bot that you're designing, or this mech, and it's got a certain level of this ornamental design put back into it. These are really nice pieces of reference as well. So you can use these for all sorts of things: material indication, learning more about reflectivity, learning about the construction, learning about the decorative style, and also the articulation points. All of that stuff is fantastic. So here's some bots. We'll just look through a few of these. Let's see. Try to find one. Try to find one that hasn't been shown before. Okay, let's look at this one. This is a little wacky. All right, so this one is not finished. Just a quick sketch, just trying to come up with an idea that then I would go back and probably redraw the legs and all the mechanism after I decide on the level, the rules of my world that this walker is living in. And once I decide that, then I can make better decisions about engineering it Is it magic? Is it steam powered? Right? All those sorts of things. So this is the initial photograph I took of this. Looks like a sort of ceremonial vase or something. I forgot to photograph the placard to speak intelligently about what it actually is. But in the end, I didn't really care because I saw this shape and I loved it. And I liked the material combinations. And so I did a quick paint over. Actually, first starts like this with just a little warp. Try and play with the overall exact same way I would sketch, right? Thinking about the silhouette, the proportion, and the stance first. Do the same with photographic start. I take the photograph, warp it, and I think about the silhouette, proportion, and stance in relation to the ground plane. And then there's the quick paint over. So I'm just using the same color palette, painting in those legs. And ultimately, in the end, if I liked this direction, I would go back in and repaint and redesign everything to this same photographic level. And I added a character for scale. And then I've just changed the nose of it a bit. And I added a bit of, this is going to be it's not going to be a horse in the end. It's just an indication of that, some mechanical exhaust pipe or something up there. And it's some steam powered sort of, steampunk-ish gold with this iridescent shell finish and gold legs. And so if I like that direction later, I'll go back, do some sketches along those lines, redraw this, and then I have my color palette, and I just start working over it until it's finished. Let's look at another one. And let's look at this guy. Oh, I don't have the layers on this one. Sorry. This one is, it was one of those fossils, though. It was a running biped of some sort. I don't remember what. Maybe a velociraptor or something like that. And so in here, what I did was, now, instead of the joints being held together with tendons and muscles, right, they're physical joints, right, with a pivot point, a cylinder connected to there, right, and then another pivot, a cylinder is connected to there, and then a knee joint, and then articulation for that is the cylinder behind here, and then there's a connection point, and then there's the hip. And so you can see all the mechanism was there in the bones, and then I stylized them and started to make it look a hybrid. Right, there's some exhaust pipes, so some sort of power plant inside here, and then there's my figure for scale, and he's doing something at the controls, trying to keep this thing under control at high speed. So the initial concept was, the inspiration came from a little photographic walk through a museum, and I really liked that start, and then just started painting over it, much like the previous one I just showed you. So you can start any way you like. You can start with sketches this way, and then go figure out the anatomy after, and add the cylinders and things and make it more real as you paint it or draw it again. You can start with photographic sources like this and paint right over the top, and that one, or you can paint right over the top of your sketches. Right, these are brush pen sketches that have just been painted directly over. And then the thing I didn't talk about, and I'm not going to cover today, is starting 3D, meaning with a 3D model and creating your mech that way, and either staying fully 3D or working over the top. It doesn't really matter if you go 2D, photograph, or 3D model. What matters is that you have a process. And the process for me is about doing research, understanding the anatomy, right, back to this heavy equipment, understanding the articulation points, and that gives it believability. And then, of course, you want to give it a purpose. So figure out what it is. Is it a slow-moving walking device or walking vehicle that does something, carries a couple people, so there's some windows, maybe some doors, or is it some sort of high-speed, relatively high-speed biped that's tough to control, so it needs these little balancing tails or something? Is it made, purely as some ceremonial thing with beautifully crafted golden legs? Is it some fantasy, scout vehicle? This guy's up out patrolling through the hills and mountains looking for something. So give it a purpose, and it's going to be much easier for you to bring everything together, so that all the elements that you add make sense. But it can be totally nonsensical in your world, but things need to make sense even for that fantasy-based concept. So I think that's about it.